On the night of May 28, 1453, the Emperor of Rome took communion. He was 49 years old. His name was Constantine XI Palaiologos. He had not slept. He would not sleep again. After the service, he did something that no emperor had done in 1,000 years. He walked through his palace and asked every man he had wronged to forgive him. Generals, servants, guards, he went to each one. Then he mounted his horse, rode to the great land walls of his city, and gave a speech to the men who would die beside him before morning. He told them they had 4 things worth dying for: their faith, their city, their emperor, their families. Then he rode back into the dark. They never found his body. The greatest city in Christendom fell at dawn on May 29, 1453. It had stood for 1,123 years. What died with it, it was the last living thread connecting the ancient world to the modern one. The Roman Empire, the same empire that crucified Christ, that Christianized the world, that gave you your laws, your calendar, your church, ended on a Tuesday morning in May because one young sultan could not stop thinking about a city he had never seen. This is the story of how a civilization died and why it still matters to the world you live in right now. To understand what was lost in 1453, you have to understand what Constantinople was, not what it had become by then, weakened, half-empty, desperate, what it had been, what it still represented. For over 1,000 years, Constantinople was the most important city on Earth. It sat at the hinge between Europe and Asia, between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. Every trade route passed through it or around it. Silk from China, spices from India, gold from Africa. It was the city through which the ancient world flowed into the medieval one. At its peak, 1 million people lived inside its walls. Rome, at the same time, had perhaps 30,000. The Hagia Sophia, the great church at the heart of the city, had the largest dome on Earth for nearly 1,000 years. When ambassadors from pagan Rus visited in the 900s, they wrote back to their prince, "We did not know whether we were in heaven or on earth." The city had running water when the rest of Europe had mud. It had libraries when most European kings could not read. It had hospitals, sewers, street lighting. It was the wall that held back every invasion from the east for 11 centuries. The Arab armies that swept across the Middle East in the 7th century, they could not take Constantinople. The Vikings tried, the Bulgars tried, the Persians tried. They all failed. The walls held. Until they didn't. The Theodosian Wall, built in the 5th century, they ran for 4 miles across the western approach to the city. A moat, an outer wall, an inner wall rising 40 feet high, towers every 50 yards. No army had ever broken them from the outside. The only time Constantinople had fallen, in 1204, it was to the 4th Crusade, attacking from the sea, by treachery, not force. By 1453, the walls were still standing, but the city behind them was dying. A century of plague, civil war, and Ottoman encirclement had gutted the population. The city that once held 1 million souls now held perhaps 50,000. The Emperor Constantine XI could muster fewer than 8,000 men to defend 14 miles of wall. He had begged the West for help. He had written to the Pope,
to Venice, to Genoa, to Hungary. He had promised church union, the reunification of Catholic and Orthodox Christianity in exchange for soldiers. Some came. A Genoese commander named Giovanni Giustiniani arrived with 700 men. That was it. The rest of Christian Europe watched and waited. Outside the walls, an Ottoman army of 60,000 to 80,000 men had assembled. At their head was a 21-year-old Sultan who'd been planning this moment since he was a child.
His name was Mehmed II. He had become Sultan at 19. His own father had been forced back to the throne to replace him after the Janissaries, the elite Ottoman soldiers, had rioted against the boy's inexperience. Mehmed had not forgotten that humiliation. When his father died and he took the throne a second time, he executed his infant brother in the bath. He was making a point. There would be no rivals. He spoke 6 languages. He read Greek history. He kept Greek scholars at his court. He was obsessed with Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar, men who had conquered the world. And he was obsessed with Constantinople. He had studied its walls since childhood. He knew their dimensions, their weak points, the history of every failed siege. He understood that no conventional army could break them. So he built something that had never existed.
His name was Urban. He was Hungarian, and he was the most dangerous man alive in 1452. Urban was a cannon maker, the finest in the world. He had first offered his services to Constantine XI. The emperor could not pay his price, so Urban went to Mehmed. Mehmed paid him 4 times what he had asked. He gave him all the bronze he needed, all the workers, all the time. What Urban built was not a cannon, it was a geological event. The barrel was 27 feet long. The walls were 8 inches thick. It fired stone balls weighing 1,200 pounds. It took 60 oxen and 200 men to move it across Thrace. When they test-fired it for the first time, people heard the sound 6 miles away. Women miscarried from the sheer force of the shockwave. Mehmed brought 3 of these cannons to the walls of Constantinople. The Theodosian walls had withstood 1,000 years of siege warfare. They had never faced this.
The siege began on April 2nd, 1453. The Ottoman fleet sealed the sea approaches. The army encircled the land walls, and Urban's great cannon began to fire. Once every 3 hours, that was the reload time. But once every 3 hours, a 1,200-pound stone ball struck the Theodosian walls. The walls that had stood for 1,000 years began to crack. Each night, Constantine's men worked through the dark, piling rubble and earth into the breaches. Each morning, the cannon fired again. The defenders were not just outnumbered, they were exhausted. 8,000 men defending 14 miles of wall, working through every night, fighting through every day. Constantine walked the walls himself. He did not sleep behind them. He was on the ramparts with his men. Inside the city, the mood had collapsed. Priests carried icons through the streets in procession. The people had heard a prophecy that Constantinople would never fall as long as the emperor lived and as long as the moon shone bright. On May 22nd, there was a lunar eclipse. The moon went dark over Constantinople. People wept in the streets. 3 days later, a thick fog covered the city. In the Ottoman camp, Mehmed's advisors saw it as a sign. The divine presence was leaving the city. God was withdrawing his protection. Mehmed set the final assault on May 29th, but there was one moment before that, one act of desperate Ottoman ingenuity that Constantine could not have prepared for. Mehmed dragged his fleet overland. 70 ships, across a hill, on wooden rollers graced with animal fat. In a single night, 70 Ottoman ships appeared inside the Golden Horn, the harbor the Byzantines had sealed with a massive iron chain. The chain meant nothing now. Constantine had been defending the sea walls with almost no one, certain the chain would hold. Now he had to split his already impossible defenses further. Every man he moved to the harbor was a man no longer on the land walls. The noose was tightening.
On the evening of May 28, 1453, Mehmed ordered something unexpected: silence. The entire Ottoman army, 80,000 men, went quiet. No drums, no horns, no movement. Inside the city, Constantine gathered his commanders for the last time. He spoke to them for a long time. He told them they were the last Romans, that Rome had survived for 1,500 years, not because its walls were strong, but because its people were willing to die on them. He told them to die for one's faith and one's city was not defeat. It was the highest thing a man could do. Then he asked them to forgive him for anything he had done wrong as their emperor. The room fell silent. His commanders wept. Some of them, the Genoese, the Venetians, the men who had no obligation to die for this city, chose to stay anyway. After the speech, Constantine went to the Hagia Sophia for the last time. He had presided over the union of the Catholic and Orthodox churches there just months before, a ceremony most of his own people had boycotted in fury. They had said they would rather see the Sultan's turban in Constantinople than a cardinal's hat. They were about to get what they wanted. Constantine took communion. He prayed. He walked out into the last dark. He rode to the Blachernae section of the wall, the area that had taken the most damage, the place where the cannon hit hardest, the most likely to break. He took his position there and waited for dawn.
The assault began at 1:30 in the morning. Mehmed sent the irregulars first, the Bashi Bazouks, undisciplined troops from across the empire, fighting for plunder, not pay. He did not care if they died. He wanted them to tire the defenders out. They hit the walls in waves. Constantine's men threw them back again and again. For 2 hours, the walls held. Then Mehmed sent the Anatolian regulars, better trained, better equipped. They took casualties and kept coming. The defenders were running out of everything: arrows, energy, time. At the Blachernae wall, a small gate, the Kirkaporta, had been left unlocked by accident. A group of Ottomans found it. 50 soldiers slipped through, then 100. They raised the Ottoman flag from a tower. The defenders saw it. The cry went up: "The city is taken." It was not yet, but the cry was enough. Panic spread along the walls faster than any army could move. At the same moment, Giovanni Giustiniani, the Genoese commander, the most important military mind in the defense, was struck by a crossbow bolt through his armor. He asked Constantine for permission to leave the walls, to seek medical treatment. Constantine begged him to stay. Giustiniani left. The soldiers who saw their commander carried away bleeding broke. They ran. Constantine rode toward the breach. He tore off his imperial regalia, the purple cloak that marked him as emperor, and fought as a soldier. The last anyone saw of him, He was charging into the mass of Ottoman troops pouring through the broken wall. On foot. He did not come back. The Ottomans searched for his body specifically. Mehmed wanted proof. He wanted the head of the last Roman emperor. They found men who looked like him, men in imperial clothing. They could not find him. Constantine XI Palaiologos, the last Roman emperor of Rome, disappeared into history on the morning of May 29, 1453. His body was never confirmed. His grave does not exist.
By noon, on May 29th, it was over. Mehmed had promised his soldiers 3 days of plunder. The churches were stripped, the libraries burned or scattered. The Hagia Sophia, the greatest church in Christendom for 916 years, was converted to a mosque before the sun set on the day the city fell. Mehmed rode to it himself. He is said to have picked up a handful of earth and poured it over his turban, a gesture of humility before God. Then he looked up at the dome and recited a Persian verse. The spider weaves the curtains in the palace of the Caesars. The owl calls the watches in Afrasib's towers. 15,000 people were enslaved in the first days. The scholars, the men who preserved Greek philosophy, mathematics, and medicine for 1,000 years while Western Europe forgot to read, fled west, to Italy, to Florence, to Rome. They brought their manuscripts with them, the texts of Plato, Aristotle, Archimedes, Ptolemy. Scholars argue to this day that the Greek refugees from Constantinople helped light the fire that became the Renaissance. The fall of Constantinople may have ended the Middle Ages. It forced European sailors to find new routes to Asia because the Ottoman Empire now controlled the old ones. 13 years after the fall of Constantinople, Christopher Columbus sailed west looking for a route to China that did not pass through Ottoman territory. He found America instead. The world you were born into, its borders, its trade routes, its civilizations, was shaped by what happened on a Tuesday morning in May 1453.
The Hagia Sophia stood as a mosque for 481 years. In 1934, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, the founder of modern Turkey, converted it to a museum, a gesture of secularism, an attempt to say, we are a modern nation, not a medieval empire. In July 2020, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan reversed that decision. The Hagia Sophia became a mosque again. Pope Francis said he was deeply saddened. Greece declared it a day of mourning. Erdogan stood in front of cameras and smiled. The argument about that building is not about architecture. It is about who owns the past, about which civilization is allowed to claim which story. Mehmed II understood this. That is why he went there first. Not to the treasury, not to the palace, to the church. Because the greatest victory is not military. It is civilizational. It is the power to stand inside someone else's sacred space and make it your own. Constantine XI knew this too. That is why he did not flee. That is why he tore off his crown and died in the rubble of his walls like a Ottoman soldier. Because a civilization that is worth remembering is worth dying for. The Roman Empire is gone. The Eastern Church has been diminished. The city that bore Constantine's name is called Istanbul now. But every time someone asks why the West and the Islamic world cannot find peace, every time you see Turkey and Greece arguing over the Aegean,
every time a leader invokes crusades or calls a rival an infidel, you are standing in the long shadow of May 29th, 1453. The walls fell. The emperor disappeared. The city changed its name. But the wound never healed. It never does.